drink it, but you can give me some anyway if you like. Okay, you ready with me, Professor? They could be waiting for you to tell them we're ready.
I'm going to repeat the trigger warning first. I'm going to go to that first. It's a data point.
Right, all ready to carry on?
Yes.
Very good, thank you.
Professor Bisby, before we start, I'm going to repeat the trigger warning I gave before, Mr. Chairman, just before we stop for lunch. I'm going to be playing in a moment or two a part of your video, your first video, your video 1, showing fire spread up the east elevation of the tower in the early stages. So people may find that distressing to look at. There's also some audio which people may find distressing to hear, so they need to absent themselves from this room or from the live stream while we play that. Before I go to that, Professor, can I ask you please to turn first of all to page 117 of your report and look at figure 58. Now this sits within the part of your report dealing with vertical fire spread and the early part of the fire, and you identify this as a picture extracted from the video, captured at 1:05:49, and you say flames visible at left of window inside compartment. I just want to pick this up with you as a data point. At this point, 1:05:49, could smoke from within the compartment be heating up the UPVC window surround, causing it to deform?
Yes.
What about radiated heat from the fire?
Yes.
Yes. Now, what I'm going to do then is to start the video and going to run it up to 1:11. And what I'd like you to do is to signal when you want to stop and identify things that are important. And the reason I want you to do that is that we've heard earlier that you have changed your opinion between your first report and your second report. And what I need you to do is to explain to me by reference to this video what we see, which enables you to come to that conclusion, focusing particularly on the timing of the fan failing and also the timing and place of where we see melting droplets of polyethylene. Okay?
Okay.
So you're going to be in control.
I will try.
Okay, all right. And if you have to go back to anything, we can do that.
Okay.
So can we start, please, Paul?
So, I mean, I just stopped it here because that's sort of coincident with the figure 58 that you showed me.
Yes.
Recently. That's about the same time. So just, again, to see here that we do see some flaming. That flaming does appear to be confined to inside the flat still. You don't see a lot of flames coming out the window. You do see a bit of smoke coming out the window, which equally could be heating the cladding above the window or adjacent to the window, admittedly to a limited extent. Yeah.
Right. Do you know whether the window is open or closed at this point?
My understanding is that the larger pane, the tilt pane, is tilted inwards, 40, 50 millimeters, a couple of inches.
And so open?
Open at the top in an inwardly tilting position, and that the window, the smaller pane beneath the extract fan, is open, according to the witness statement, approximately 10 inches, I believe, is what Mr. Cavede says.
Thank you.
So go ahead, Paul.
I lay on the fire. of blood. I'm going over here though. Graveyard shift and I'm seeing the ends a light. Don't know whose yard that is, but that's someone's
Stop
yard.
it, Paul. Yeah. So I mean, that's not a very good frame to stop on there, unfortunately. But so at this stage, again, we can see flames inside the flat, and again, it's hard to say the extent to which those flames might be projecting outside the window. So we still see a similar condition, although the fire is clearly growing a bit in time as we go forward.
But still contained within the compartment, you think, at this stage?
It appears to be, yes.
I mean, I think by this stage, Professor Torero says that it has exited the compartment, or that the earliest point at which it could have done has passed at 1:05. Can you comment on that?
I think that the basis upon which Professor Torero is making that statement is related to a still image that does show some falling debris from the window, which could potentially be droplets of polyethylene burning and falling from the window. But it's very, very limited at this stage.
Yes.
And you will have noticed in my report that we've put that time where we would be more comfortable confirming that the fire was within the cladding and burning the polyethylene closer to 108, 109 in my report, I believe.
His image is, I think, at 01:05:57. Just for reference purposes, it's page 56 of his statement, of his report. Let's continue.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Getting smoked. I'll be pissed if that was my yard underneath or on top or sideways. Mad. Look at that though, it stinks. Mad thing. Just at the ends.
Anytime here, Paul? Yeah, okay. So in this sequence here, around 107:51 and some seconds after that, what we see here is that flames are passing underneath the fan mounting unit. It's hard to say whether that's through the bottom of the infill panel or some flames coming out of the open, inwardly opening window immediately below the extract fan. It's also difficult to say definitively whether or not the extract fan is still in place here, although it appears to be.
Right.
And then I'll get you, Paul, to just continue a little bit more, please. Just pause there. Sorry, if you can go back a little bit. Apologies. So there is a moment there, just at the end of that clip, where you, So in that view there, you can see a circular opening in the location where we would expect the extract fan to be.
Does it appear to you that the extract fan is still in place?
No, it would appear to me, on the basis of this, that the extract fan has fallen out.
Right.
And unfortunately, that could have occurred even before 105:49. It's possible. We just don't have very good views to be able to say definitively when the extract fan has fallen out.
On this still frame, you can see a circular orange disc, but with a black bar across it. Might that tell you that the extract fan was still in place or not?
I think what we're seeing there is the larger bright spot is, I think, the opening where the extract fan would have sat. So that is a hole through a window infill panel. It's a circular opening through a window infill panel.
Yes.
And the flames, the little piece of flame that you can see under that, I would suggest is either flames coming from the bottom of the infill panel or through the open window immediately below the extract fan. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Paul. Any minute. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah. So here, this next sequence, you really just see the fire continuing to grow within the flat. Increasingly, we see flames coming through the extract fan and through that either open or absent window beneath the extract fan, and indeed a little bit of flaming coming, it would appear, through the tilt, the inwardly tilting window as well.
By this stage, 01:08:16, have we seen any falling burning material yet?
I don't I mean, aside from the still photo that Professor Torero has used, no significant. We should see it in a few moments.
The reason I ask is if you go, and I wonder whether there's a way of having both on the screen at the same time, but if you go to figure 60 of your report at page 119, I don't know if it is possible to have both on the screen at the same time, but if you go to figure 60, you've got, and maybe we haven't arrived at it yet.
Yeah, so we'll see that. Yeah, we will see that in a moment if we continue
very
this
good.
clip.
Then let's
so
just pass quickly.
If everybody
let's pass
watches
the
just the
video.
lower left-hand side of the window, they should see some debris dropping down in a moment.
Before we do that, can you tell from this frame or the sequence which leads to it what is combusting?
No,
Right.
I couldn't say. It's also noteworthy here that there does appear to be flaming sort of more towards the left-hand side of the window, although given that it's sort of shielded by the view angle, it's hard to say for sure.
Right. Can we continue, please?
So can you pause it there, Paul? So here you can see 109.34, and there you can now see sort of a semi-continuous stream of lit particles from the lower left-hand side of the window.
Right. Can I just ask you, I'm sorry to do this, go back to the last end of the last sequence. I want you to look for burning, falling material coming out of the window at that stage, before we get to 109. You can just go back to that. Just play from there. Like there.
Yep.
We can see burning material.
Yep.
At 101.08.19. What is that, do you think?
I couldn't say.
Is that...
It's possible that it's polyethylene. It could also be things that are coming out from inside the flat. We have the purl board immediately above the window, which I would expect to be burned or burning at this stage.
Right.
And you have various other things around the window that could potentially be burning. The droplets that we just saw falling are not falling sort of straight down in a very sort of dedicated seeming manner. They're kind of a bit floating away from the building. Later on, when we see the polyethylene, the burning and dripping polyethylene, that tends to be sort of a more vertical, the particles are falling with a bit more intent, if you see what I mean.
Yes. Okay, we can continue.
Dropping down.
Does it stop there, Paul? So you did hear someone in the background there say it sounds like it's dropping down.
Yeah.
So I would expect that they're commenting on things falling to the ground. In this photo, you can clearly see that the extract fan is now absent from the panel. There's very clearly a hole there now, and there's quite a lot of flame within the compartment and a little bit exiting the compartment at this stage.
We saw within this sequence, I think actually the end of the last sequence, the flowing, dripping material. Do you say that's polyethylene?
I think it's probable that it's polyethylene, but I couldn't possibly say
If it were,
with certainty.
where would it be coming from?
It would be coming, given the location that it's dripping from, it would be coming either from the column cassette to the left of the window,
Yes.
or from the spandrel cassette immediately above and to the left of the window, I would say. Or some combination of those two, potentially.
Right. And if it were coming from the column cassette to the, you say to the left of the window, you mean?
As I'm looking
as you're
from the
looking
outside.
at it.
Yeah.
What is the mechanism by which that polyethylene would have ignited at this point?
Well, as we've discussed, we essentially have these two candidates, my two hypotheses, B1 and B2. One is that the fire and hot gas get into the cladding via the UPVC window boards, which we will have to assume have been removed in some way, or because flame and hot gas are exiting the compartment via the extract fan panel or the open window and impinging on that column cassette immediately outside the window or immediately above the window. So it could be either. To be honest, and I do say this at some stage in my report, I think that the only credible answer to that question is that it's going to be some combination of those two, because no matter what, the hot gas and flames exiting the compartment are going to be heating the cladding externally, and no matter what, you are going to be getting heat through the window surround, whether it's there or not, and into the cladding. It's a question of the relative importance of those two modes of heating the cladding, and I would be very hard-pressed to say which one I think is dominant, if that makes sense.
On the basis of the visual inspection of these videos?
On the basis of any of the evidence that I've seen, yeah.
Right.
Can you help me just make sure I've understood what I'm seeing in some of these pictures? If we look at the one on the screen at the moment,
Yep.
we take it, do we, that the top of that brightly illuminated window is where the fan was?
The sort of circular opening, yes.
And
The bright, yeah.
would it be right to infer from this and the previous films that the large window, which is to the left of the small window with the fan as you stand in the kitchen, or to the right of you, is not as heavily involved?
Well, it is not open. So, I mean, it is, it's hard to see on this screen, but it is here.
It's there, but I mean,
Yeah?
the impression I get from what I'm seeing here, and it's true for the earlier shots, is that the fire is impinging on the, as we view it from here, left-hand window where the fan was, but not nearly so much on the right-hand large window, which could be relevant for identifying the point at which breakout occurs.
Yes. I mean, the important thing to recognize in this view is that this smaller window here is an inward swinging window that opens like that, and it's open 10 inches, so it's essentially wide open. So you're looking straight into the kitchen here, whereas the right-hand window is closed from a visual perspective, and so and it could have some soot deposition on it, which is causing it to be slightly sort of frosted at this stage in the fire, which is why it looks a lot darker. Yeah, does that make sense? So,
it does.
But it does appear to me that there is more flaming to the left of the window. That is certainly something that is true.
And I ask because I think you've suggested that the fire might have come out of the kitchen along at the top of the window rather than at the side of the window, to put it in a rather general way. But if it came out at the top of the window, it's going to be the top of the small window, not the top of the large window.
It's going to be the extract fan.
Yeah.
The hole in the extract fan panel will be the primary route that I would suggest, as well as the window immediately below.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
At this stage, different question, but at this stage, was the XPS involved?
It appears to me that some of the flaming that we see around the extract fan infill panel will be associated with combustion of the XPS. I would consider that highly probable, given that we have flaming and hot gases there, yes.
Okay.
Although, as I've noted, there's not a huge mass of material there, so it could burn away quite quickly.
Yes.
And then you're just left with 2 aluminium sheets.
Yes.
Okay. Paul, yeah.
They finished. This one.
Is it yours, bro?
Yeah.
Hey, you lot, come away from there! Come away from there! Come on! Get over there!
Come over there.
Okay, there, Paul? Okay, so here, I've stopped the video here because we can now see on the ground there is actually some burning debris on the ground directly beneath the window. My assumption would be that that would be polyethylene that has dripped whilst burning, forming a small pool fire on the ground. So at this stage, 109.58, we're reasonably certain that we have polyethylene burning and melting within the cladding by some means.
Yeah. And would that, do you know whether that would be self-sustaining by this stage? Or would this,
Within the cladding?
Within the cladding.
You know, if you have polyethylene burning and dripping out of cladding such as this, and either you have a continued source of external heat flux or you have a pooling of that polyethylene in the location where it's continuing to burning, then yes, I would say at this stage you would have a fire that we would expect to propagate if left to its own devices.
Yes.
Okay, Paul.
Fire started to drop, bro. Whoa!
Fire brigades! Look, the house. Yikes! Don't make fires, kids. Parents, keep your kids away. Like yeah, fire brigade.
Okay, can you stop it here, Paul? I mean, it's very difficult to see here through the trees, but what we do see in this next sequence is you do see now quite a lot of smoke coming out of the compartment and quite a lot of flame coming out of the compartment as well. Go ahead, Paul.
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله دعاك يقول رمضان مش حد عافية في العمارة Oh my God!
Anywhere here? Yeah. So here, what's interesting is you can see now quite a lot of flaming below the spandrel panel. It's difficult to say whether those flames are emanating from within the compartment itself or whether that is an indication that we have polyethylene within that spandrel panel that's actually burning and dripping and burning whilst it falls away. The location where you see a bright spot on the spandrel panel below the kitchen window of flat 16, the only explanation I could give for that is that is burning polyethylene on the surface of the spandrel panel. The likely candidate for where that polyethylene would have come from would be the spandrel panel above the kitchen window. Above the kitchen window.
What about to the side, to the left of the kitchen window?
In the location that it is, I think it's unlikely that it would come from the side and end up there.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Paul.
getting worse. يا تقدر احمد يطلع it's over.
Just pausing there, if I can ask you to pause there. Sorry, you may be about to do it. But you can see the flames now impinging upon the 90-degree return of the aluminium panel above the kitchen.
Yep.
Would that tell you anything about ingress of fire into the dark crack that we looked at earlier this morning, behind which is exposed PE?
I mean, certainly at this stage, I would expect flaming inside the cavity behind the ACM panel, yes.
Okay.
I would expect those flames to travel up through that gap, yes.
Right.
Hey man, what's happening, bro? I read.
Right here, go back a bit, Paul, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes.
What I'm looking for is sort of 113.31. We see a little pulse of flame. There.
Yes.
Yeah, so we start to see now this pulsing of flames. Those flames are exiting the gap, the vertical gap between the first and second spandrel panels immediately above the kitchen window of flat 16, which would indicate that you have some pyrolysis or evaporation of liquefied polyethylene within the cavity above flat 16.
So that's behind the cassette.
There's something going on inside that cassette.
Right.
And the gases are coming out, they're hot, they're finding oxygen, and they're flaming.
Had you seen any evidence visually of that phenomenon before this point?
In this particular, at Grenfell Tower or in other fires?
Yes, at Grenfell, in this sequence.
I think this is the first time we see this happening specifically at Grenfell in the footage that we have, yeah. And just before you continue, Paul, what you'll see in a minute, if this continues, in just a couple more seconds, you'll see a similar sort of licking or pulsing of flame slightly to the left, which is along the corner, or the re-entrant corner where the column joins the spandrel panel above flat 16. And you'll see that extend, I think, a little bit farther up. Let's go ahead. Yeah, there it is. So that's the joint between the column and the spandrel panel. And again, it indicates to me that there's something going on within those cassettes at that location.
The people above it, there must be problems, huh?
Okay, stop it there, Paul. Just anywhere there. Yeah. So at this point, I think it's quite clear that the cladding is involved. The ACM cladding cassettes are involved, and that this fire is likely to escalate up the building, supported primarily by combustion of the ACM and the polyethylene. So I think that's as far as we really need to go here.
Right.
And so sort of, just to sort of say where does that leave me with respect to my two hypotheses is probably the next question.
That was the next question.
Yeah. So where it leaves me with a situation that I have Professor Torrero's analysis, which suggests to me that the gas layer in the kitchen is between 200 and 300 degrees Celsius, most likely, and that we have flame impingement on whatever is going on inside the kitchen at that stage. If we assume that the UPVC is physically absent, then, and if we assume that along with the UPVC goes the 25 millimeter thick PIR, which is adhered to the back of the UPVC, then we have EPDM weatherproofing membrane, which would provide negligible resistance to flame impingement and those types of gas temperatures, and it would burn through quite rapidly. And then we're into the back of the cladding. And as Professor Torrero said yesterday, at that point, with flame impingement and those types of gas temperatures, it's anyone's guess as to which material is sort of the first ignited material within the cavity. Outside the window, I have flames and hot gases exiting. I have impingement of those flames and hot gases directly above and potentially to the left, if I'm outside the building, looking at the building of the window. And at some stage, we see polyethylene melted and dripping and falling from that region to the left-hand side of the window as I'm looking at it from the outside. I think where that leaves us is in a situation where no matter how you look at this, you have some combination of those two heating mechanisms that are causing eventually the ignition of the cladding and the escalation of the fire spread up the building. So, I mean, if you look at, for instance, I was looking at this over the lunch break, paragraph 713 in my report, I sort of finished this section on B1 and B2. It's immediately below the paragraph that you read previously, and I say, indeed, it is probable that some combination of the fire spread routes suggested in B1 and B2 conspired to cause the initial ignition and sustained burning of the external cladding. So that's kind of where I end up with it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess I would like to say also, with respect to this issue, that for me, it's almost a secondary issue. I can understand why we want to get to knowing sort of more confidently which one it is. But at the end of the day, there's a number of mechanisms by which cladding of this nature, rain screen cladding of this nature, could be ignited on the outside of a building. And to focus too heavily on the specifics of what has happened in this particular fire scenario, I think in a way diminishes the importance of recognizing the clear risks that it presents under any scenario. So I wouldn't want to labor the point too much.
No, I understand that. And picking up 713, I mean, the purpose of this exercise, in a sense, is to see if you can come to an opinion with a reasonable degree of confidence about, although they're combined, whether B1 or B2 is the more likely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can tell that I'm not enthusiastic to be drawn on this point. I think at this stage, if you really push me, I would say that fire spread through the UPVC is ahead by a nose.
All right.
Yeah.
And let me try a different way. When you're obviously looking at it from a visual perspective and forming your opinions based on what you see. Mm-hmm. you can see burning droplets. They were coming, I think, from the bottom of the window. Or is that...
That's where we see them exiting the window box.
Yeah.
Yep.
My question is that not more consistent with B2? Hypothesis B2?
B2 being through the UPVC, yes?
Yes.
I mean, perhaps, but as we discussed earlier when I was pointing out the detail of the cladding cassette alongside the window, the exposed edge of polyethylene in that particular location is external to the cavity. So that vertical line of PE immediately to the left of the window, if I'm looking at the window, is actually external. So if it is coming directly from that location, then I think we sort of have to hold our hand in the air and say we don't know.
Right. Now, again, I think...
That does depend on being able to see clearly enough where the droplets are coming from.
Indeed, and we can't because of the angle that we're looking at it.
And also the fact that if they were coming from above the window, they're falling past the window, which is itself highly illuminated by the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So does that make it more or less difficult to...
Well, if they are coming from above the window, given the way that cassette is configured, essentially it's a box that goes like that.
Yeah.
You essentially have a trough internal to the cavity of that location, and your burning polyethylene is going to come out either end of the trough at the vertical cracks. Given that I would expect the predominant heating to be above the extract fan, the left-hand side falling out, it's possible. But again, I mean, I don't know that we will ever know the answers to these questions.
Try something on you. I mean, we've treated the UPVC as a single entity. But can you help us with the temperatures that Professor Torreira has identified within the compartment? Would it be more likely that the UPVC would fail and fall away and open up at the top as opposed to the bottom?
I think so, yes.
If that is so, would it not also be the case that therefore there was a more likely ingress of fire from the inside of the compartment through the gap created by the UPVC at the top by the window?
Indeed, yes.
And that would also therefore explain, or could explain, that, or support rather, hypothesis B2.
Indeed, yes.
So that in fact, although the flaming droplets might well have been coming from the top end of the window jamb on the right-hand side as you look out, in fact, the ingress of fire into the cavity could well have come through the UPVC there.
Yes, and indeed the way that the rail that holds the window framing onto the building terminates at that location would allow flames and hot gases exiting at the top right-hand corner if you're inside looking out to access the spandrel panel as well as the column panel just above the window. So yes, it's possible.
It's possible. And putting into the mix that possibility, how would that then square against the possibility of your hypothesis B1, namely flame impingement directly through the gap left by the extract vent or the open window?
I don't think that would necessarily impact my previous statement that I would say, via the UPVC failing is ahead by a nose, but not by a significant margin.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to say, of course, we also have the analysis by Professor Torreira, and he clearly has a preference, I think, in his report. And Dr. Lane also, I think, expresses a clear preference for the UPVC failing mode. In her report, the only thing I would say, and I'm sure that Professor Torreira would agree with me on this, is that his analysis, as you've pointed out, is a simplified analysis. It's quite a straightforward, quite a simple analysis. And it doesn't take account of, for instance, the purl board immediately inside the window and the potential for that to burn and flame, or the potential for the extract fan infill panel to burn and provide some flames as well.
No.
So his model only deals with gas layer temperatures and flame impingement due to a ceiling jet from an object burning at some distance from the window. So there are a number of assumptions inherent in all of this that I think we have to keep in mind.
Yes.
Yeah. And so hence my inability to be more confident, with apologies.
Well, thank you. Can I just take you then back into your report at page 122? I want just to pick up figure 66. This is actually page 123. I think it probably spans the two, in fact. You identify in the text at figure 66, at the bottom of the page, intermittent flaming between the spandrel cassettes above between level 4 and level 5. And we saw that on the video, and you showed us that.
Yep.
And also intermittent flaming at the vertex of the column and the spandrel. Is that more consistent with hypothesis B1 or with B2?
The intermittent flaming at the junction between the spandrels, I would say, is more consistent with the flames venting hypothesis. The flaming at the column could be due to either of those hypotheses.
Right. And under hypothesis B1, would one expect to see the burning of the cladding directly or more directly above the window, as opposed to on the side, as we do?
I would expect that, given the buoyancy of hot gases and the tendency for flames to move in that direction, yes.
So would that not then tend to support hypothesis B2 over B1? Or is that just short nose again?
I think so, yes.
Right. I think we're now... All right. Similar question. Look at figure 68A, please. This is thermal imaging, page 126 of your report. And you've set out the relevant thermal images at second pulse and a second after the second pulse at 114 odd. Looking at this, is the picture that these show, particularly figure 68A, the heat still there after the second pulse, after the first pulse, and then the absence of it after the second pulse, is that consistent with your hypothesis B1 that the fire vented out of the open window or the extract fan?
The hot spot, as Professor Torero discussed yesterday, given the resolution of these images, it's difficult to say anything too conclusive about them. That hot spot in this image does appear to be approximately in the location of the extract fan panel, which could indicate that this is a time, and here we're at, about 114?
Yes.
So it could just simply be the extract fan panel burning, or it could be, it could be anything burning in that location, but it's in the approximate location of the extract fan panel, I would say.
Right, right. Does this evidence help us in any way decide as between hypothesis B1 and B2?
Not really, in my opinion, no.
Moving on to some other evidence, we have some evidence from firefighter Daniel Brown that after 1:20 a.m., so it's a little bit later, he could see within the cavity behind the panels and could see fire travelling up the building. And you'll recall, he leant out of the window and aimed his jet into them. And he says in his contemporaneous notes, and just for the record, this is MET 000 5251 at page 3. He says that the fire was travelling in an upwards direction behind the cladding. It was easy to see, he says, the material behind it was alight and travelling in an upwards direction. However, the vast majority of the cladding remained in place, and any attempts to extinguish simply bounced off. And similar evidence later when he gave evidence and in his statement to the police in a fuller form. Does that help you again decide between B1 and B2?
No, because I think at that stage we're quite well along in the vertical progression of the fire at the cladding, and so regardless of how it started, we have a very well developed fire in the cladding at that stage.
And on a similar vein, Charlie Batterby said in his evidence, and this was his oral evidence in the transcript for the 28th of June, page 85, he said that once inside the room, I could see the fire had vented because the window had gone. Again, does that help you?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Why is that? Because it's too late?
Too late, yeah. Not with respect to ignition of the cladding in any case.
Right. Is it fair to say that the fire would eventually have come out of the failed window in any event? Unless it had been extinguished?
Yes. I think we have to assume when designing cladding systems of any type that a fire venting from a window is a likely scenario.
Now, You'll have seen Professor Torero's views about your hypothesis B1, and he says that that is highly unlikely and easily to be disproved by testing. What do you say to that?
I would be happy to attempt to disprove it by testing with some assistance in how I might do that from Professor Torero.
Having considered his report and heard him give evidence yesterday, do you disagree with Professor Torero?
In what respect? In respect of that statement?
Yes.
Yes, I think I do.
Because he says hypothesis, let's be clear, hypothesis, well, let me show you what he says so we're clear about what it is I'm asking you to agree with. Can you be shown, please, JTOS 601 at page 46? Paragraph, lines 13, 14 to 15. So he says hypothesis B1, as indicated by Professor Bisby.
I think, is this his most recent version of his report? Because I think he's referring to my original B1.
He may well be.
In this
location.
I
can hear mutterings around me, which rather indicates that I should...
I think this is referring to the fire starts in the extract fan as a hypothesis.
Now, moving forward then, to talk about direct flame impingement through an open window, is it relevant, having considered Professor Torero's report and also seen your own work based on the visual inspections of the video, is it relevant that flames would have come out from a hot compartment into a relatively cool atmosphere outside?
I mean, certainly one of the consequences of venting outside is a cooling effect, both on the gases and on the flames as a consequence of the cold air entrainment that would occur, yes. Would
that have affected the ability of flames coming out of the open window or the gap left by the vent extract fan to impinge upon the ACM?
I mean, potentially, but we see flames impinging on the ACM in the footage, so we do know it's happened. The question is whether or not the time at which it happens, which is admittedly 2 to 3 minutes after we suspect that we see involvement of the ACM cladding, gives us enough confidence that that is the primary candidate for ignition of the cladding, or whether that is a secondary effect that happens after the cladding has already ignited from within. The takeaway for me yesterday from Professor Torero's testimony with respect to all of these issues was that inside the compartment you have a hot smoke layer at 200 to 300 degrees Celsius, and you have flames impinging on the region near the window. Outside the compartment you have hot smoke which is venting from the compartment at a maximum of 200 to 300 degrees Celsius and is, as a consequence of venting, now somewhat cooler than inside the compartment. And the same with the flames. You have flames venting from the compartment impinging on the cladding, however, again, somewhat less than inside the compartment. So if we agree that the UPVC window framing boards absolutely are absent, then I agree with Professor Torero that the most likely candidate is the hypothesis where the ignition happens via the side of the window through the UPVC. But as I've explained, I wasn't in the kitchen, so I don't know for sure that the UPVC boards were absent. I think it's likely, but I wouldn't be able to say that it is definitive.
Yes.
And, as I've said, I think at the end of the day, it's some combination of the two.
Now, I want to, excuse me, I want to turn next to a different topic, which is initial spread up the east face, if I can, please, Professor. And I'll start by asking you about internal firefighting, and then I'm going to turn to external firefighting. internal firefighting first of all, do you agree in principle that there is a defined point in time at which compartmentation, in general terms, is breached?
Yes, yes.
Is that point in time when smoke and or flames extend out of the compartment of origin? Or is it as soon as any of the combustible components of the facade, in the case of Grenfell Tower, ignites?
It's the moment when any secondary fire compartment is compromised by hot smoke or flames.
What do you mean by secondary fire compartment?
So the flat of origin is a fire compartment.
Yes.
It's a fire-rated box. The most likely candidate for next compromised would be the flat directly above, which is also intended to be a fire-rated box. Given that fires aren't supposed to move from one fire-rated box to another fire-rated box, I would say that compartmentation is effectively lost when flat 26 is compromised by the vertically spreading fire.
Right. So not then, is this right, not then at the moment when the ACM panels ignite outside flat 16?
I think that's, one could argue that, but if the definition of fire compartmentation is that the fire is confined to a single compartment in a building, let's take the case of a fire in a building that doesn't have a cladding system that spreads flame externally, and you have a fire in your kitchen, the kitchen window is open or has an extract fan, the fire vents from the kitchen window. You do have hot smoke and flame exiting your compartment and impinging on the cladding above that flat, but we wouldn't call that a failure of compartmentation unless the flat above, their window breaks and the flames get in or whatever, and then you have a secondary flat. So for me, if the fire had gone out into the cladding and the fire had spread in the cladding, but no other flats in the building had been at all affected by that, then whilst the fire has left the compartment of origin, it hasn't caused any other spaces in the building to be affected by the fire. And that's the key thing with the compartmentation strategy.
So for you,
the affecting of other spaces.
Yes, I see. So for you, a breach of compartmentation, the line is crossed when the next firebox is breached, not when the first firebox is breached.
That's what I would say, yes.
Right,
But
okay.
doesn't that depend on how and why the first firebox is breached? Because in the ordinary instance that you've indicated, you don't know whether there's going to be a break-in in the flat above. But the nature of this fire was such that once it was established in the cladding, it was almost inevitable, if not actually inevitable, that it would affect other boxes, wasn't it?
I mean, I agree in this case there is an inevitability, but of course cladding isn't supposed to do this. So I guess I'm struggling to understand what the point of the question is.
Well, I think the point of the question is to work out, the people speak of compartmentation linked to stay put, and it's part of a bigger design principle, and it's not for me to tell you, but it's really a question of focusing on a point in time which we can all understand as what we mean by compartmentation has been breached or lost. I'm suggesting to you that it's lost when the components of the cladding on the exterior of flat 16 in this particular case are alight.
I mean, I can go along with that in this case, but if we had, as I said, if we had a building that had a different cladding system, where some element of the cladding system was combustible, but it didn't result in a rapid escalation of vertical fire spread up the exterior of the building, would we call that loss of compartmentation? No, I don't think we would. Right. So I think it's the consequences that are the issue, as opposed to the potential consequences, right? It's what actually happens. Yeah. So when that flat above, flat 26, becomes involved, you now have lost your firebox, your sealed, your fire-rated box in your building.
There's a question I was going to ask you later on, but I might as well ask it to you now. In your experience, do you know of a cladding fire which has not resulted in flats in a high-rise building other than the flat of origin being breached?
That has not resulted in it.
Yes. In other words, a cladding fire which didn't break back in.
I mean, not specifically, because we tend not to hear about them, because they don't. So they're not newsworthy in that sense.
Right.
My understanding from speaking to colleagues who work in the fire services internationally would be that it is reasonably routine to have fires in multi-story buildings that don't spread to other fire compartments via the exterior. Depends on the characteristics of the cladding system.
Right.
I mean, we could think of a number of cases where that has happened, and you have seen fire spread vertically where you didn't have ACM. Maybe you had window infill panels or some other type of cladding system that presented fire spread risks. But I think we only know about them because that occurred, if that makes sense.
Yes. Now, I'm just trying to get a feel for the inevitability which the chairman has put to you. When we come back to Grenfell Tower, looking at the geometry and configuration of this cladding structure, was it, in your opinion, inevitable that once the cladding had ignited, it would spread in the way you've identified, and therefore inevitable that it would breach other compartments?
Yes.
So in practical terms, would it be right to say that actually compartmentation, to all intents and purposes, was breached once the cladding was alight outside flat 16?
Sure, noting my slight disagreement with that definition.
All right.
I'll go along with you.
External firefighting, moving ahead. Can I ask you please to look at a video clip? Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if I should keep repeating the trigger warning. I should say
it's better if you
it probably
do.
is better. Again, repeat the trigger warning. I'm going to be showing the professor. He'll be showing us his second clip, LBYS number 2, and this also will show pictures of the building on fire on the exterior and has audio attached to it. And some people will find it distressing and may need to leave the room or remove themselves from the live stream. So give people a few seconds before we show this. And can I ask Paul if we can move to the sequence at 1:15 and 53 seconds. Now, I've shown you quite a bit of that. In this clip, we can see a covering jet, which we can still see in the part we've frozen on, being started up and aimed underneath the window. From what you've seen, Professor, now you've seen and analysed all of the video clips that you've got, and they may not be complete, of course. Is this the first visual confirmation of the jet being in use?
Yes.
Now, I don't need to take you to this, but we have a document from the LFB, which is their ORR, their operational report, response report, which has a time at 1:11, which suggests that a jet was being applied at 1:11 and that it was being applied above the window. Have you seen anything to support that statement?
No, I've not.
In your opinion, could earlier external firefighting, in other words, earlier to 1:16 that we've seen, have made a difference?
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it's hard to say with any certainty. The only evidence that I could bring to answering that question is that I've seen a number of cladding fire tests on large-scale 9-meter-high rigs where fires involving combinations of materials similar to this, i.e. PIR backing insulation and an ACM PE rain screen, in a fire that is developed and spreading up the cladding 1 to 2 stories, not dissimilar to we see here, although admittedly higher up in the air in this case. I've seen those fires extinguished with relative ease in test lab scenarios. Now, obviously noting that there could be significant differences between those systems in those scenarios, not knowing the differences in terms of the firefighting kit that's used in order to do that, in terms of the volumes of water that are deployed by the hoses and the pressures, et cetera, et cetera. But I have seen these fires visually similar to this, involving similar materials, extinguished in fire testing laboratories, yes. So I think it is not impossible in theory.
Knowing what you do about the composition of the materials in this cladding structure and their geometry, in your opinion, would spraying a jet above the window of flat 16 have made a material difference to fire spread by 1:15 a.m.?
That's a very, very difficult and I recognize very important question. Again, I would say it's possible, but I'm not a firefighter. I would not want to say one way or another for sure.
On the basis that the jet's being applied from the ground, would it have been possible for water to reach behind the cladding outside flat 16, whether in the column or in the spandrels, or indeed the spandrels above the kitchen, if that is where there was fire?
I mean, it's a ventilated rain screen facade. It's meant to exclude rain, which would be water coming predominantly from above. In terms of water coming from below, one imagines that water could get into the cladding via the cracks and openings that we've discussed in looking at the configuration of the cladding. Whether the amount of water that one could get into the cavity, and assuming that there's burning going on within the cavity, would be sufficient to extinguish a fire, a growing fire of this nature, again, I think it's very difficult to say with any certainty. I think it's possible, but not definitive.
Possible, but not definitive. There's a range, though, in that. Would it be probable or improbable?
I don't know. Genuinely, I couldn't say.
All right. Vertical fire spread, if I can turn to that. Can I go first to your report at page 152? And I'm going to ask you to look, please, at paragraphs 478 to 450. Sorry, 748 to 750.
I mean, Mr. Miller, if it's all right, I'd like to, having thought about what you just asked me, I'd like to come back to it and add a comment, if I may.
Yes, sir.
The reason that I assume that those questions on external firefighting are a consequence of some comments that I've added to my supplemental report in terms of the observations I made about external firefighting activities in the early stages of the fire. The reason that I did that is because of the LFB document, which states that there was a covering jet directed above the fire at around 111 that had no effect on the fire. Now, if that is the case, then it's important that we know that. And if that isn't the case, then it's equally important that we know that. The consequence, both in terms of truth in this event and in terms of the fact that we have a large number of buildings in the UK with non-compliant cladding systems on them, and I would expect that firefighting tactics would be influenced by whether or not an attempt was made and was proven effective or not in this context. So that's why I did it, and I just think it's important to state that.
Now, that's obviously left a factual question open. On the hypothesis that the operational response report is correct and that a covering jet was applied above the window at 111, it may not have been for terribly long. What conclusions would you draw from that if that was a fact? I
mean, that would indicate that it is potentially very difficult to extinguish one of these fires, even if that's done very early on. I mean, keep in mind that at 111, the fire, we could look at the video of the fire in that region, and it's still quite small and localized. It hasn't extended anywhere near what it has by 115 when we see the covering jet applied. So if it is genuinely not possible to relatively easily extinguish a fire, which at that stage at least visually, is quite a small fire, although admittedly in the cladding, then that's an important piece of information as regards the safety of people who are potentially living in buildings with non-compliant cladding on them.
Yes. Now, approaching it from a different angle, assuming that the fact as recorded in the operational response report at 111 is not a fact, in other words, didn't happen, no covering jet above the window at that time, what conclusions would you draw from that, having seen the video that you've shown us of the progression of the fire?
That if there were a fire in a building and the fire brigade were to attend that fire and they were to see a fire that looked not dissimilar to this, and they were to be aware that that building had cladding on it that was not necessarily the cladding we would want on it, if it was one of these buildings that's been identified with non-compliant cladding on it, that they would attempt to spray the exterior of the building, potentially before they send a crew in, which is what I understand prevented. One of the reasons they didn't spray, in this case, the exterior of the building, was because of some operational rules that are followed in the fire service that you don't spray into a compartment where you may have colleagues inside for the sake of the safety of the colleagues inside. So that may change, a decision about what it is that you do first in that fire scenario. Maybe it would be better to put out the external cladding fire first to be sure that you've dealt with that, and then to attempt to fight the fire internally, or some combination of activities that might be a bit different.
Which leads then, I think, just to confirm the question I asked before, having done this little circuitous route. If, in fact, it turns out that there was no covering jet placed above the window, flat 16 at 111, is it right you can't say whether it's probable or improbable that effective external firefighting would have extinguished this fire?
I couldn't say.
You couldn't say. You say it's possible, but not definite, but you can't tell me where on the spectrum between those two it is.
I mean, my view is that in the absence of any information, it's certainly worth a try.
Right. Vertical fire spread. I think I was showing you what's now on the screen. Just gone. Let's come back. 748 to 750. And you've got regulation B4 up there, and you say the functional objective of B4 is that the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. And you say the functional objective was clearly not achieved at Grenfell Tower. I think it's right that you haven't at this stage considered compliance with the guidance in approved document B, have you?
Not significantly, no.
You do, though, go on to say at paragraph 751 and 752, and particularly in 752, that, and picking it up in the third line of 752, on the basis that fire compartmentation was not a credible component of any fire safety strategy, once the refurbishment cladding had been installed at Grenfell Tower, it follows logically that a stay-put policy was also not a credible component of any fire safety strategy once the refurbishment cladding had been installed. And I show you that. And there are three, I think, reasons why you say that in terms of directions of fire spread: upward, downward, and horizontal. And those different theories underpin this basic thesis that a stay-put policy was not a credible component of any fire safety strategy at Grenfell after the refurbishment.
I mean, the fundamental assertion that I'm making here is that if a fire is ignited in a cladding system such as this, made from these materials, under any circumstances, we have to expect it to spread quickly and catastrophically because of the nature of the materials involved. And on that basis, it is unreasonable to expect compartmentation to be maintained, and on that basis, it is unreasonable to have a stay-put policy in place. Now, of course, that relies on someone recognizing that they've got this material on their building,
Yes.
Which is clearly not the case, apparently, here.
Well,
I recognize it's quite a strong statement, but it's in a sense a philosophical one.
Well, so philosophical, and that's your opinion.
Yes, but it relies on this assumption that people actually are aware of the cladding that they have on their building.
Yes. Now, I'm going to ask you some detailed questions about your analysis of each of the three routes of fire spread, upward first, then downward, and then horizontal, if I can. Before I do that, can I just ask you to look briefly at Dr. Lane's basic hypothesis. This is BLAS 5010 at page 5, and this is figures 10.2 and 10.3 of Dr. Lane's report. We can just have those up there. They're there for you. She has identified 6 different pathways for fire spread. And you can see those particularly in 10.2, and then you also got F in 10.3. I have questions about A and D, the columns. They represent the 2 vertical channels, I think, that you say played an important role in the fire spread on the night.
That's correct.
That's right, is it? Now, Dr. Lane's also identified a 3rd vertical pathway, E. You can see it, it's yellow in figure 10.2, which I think is via the insulating core panels which connect between the spandrel panels. Would you agree with her?
I mean, I would agree that those are continuous bands of material that can burn. I'm not sure that I would agree that I've seen either evidence or a physical mechanism by which that is a direction of travel of a fire front, if you see what I mean.
I do. We'll leave aside fire front. We may come back to that. Can I just ask you to be shown page 39 of Dr. Lane's report, figure 10.37, under paragraph 10.7.2, which is a photograph of the vertical fire spread up insulating core panels, estimated time at 1:26, taken off YouTube. Now, her view is that this image shows evidence of fire spread up the insulating core panels. My first question is, have you considered that as a pathway?
I've considered the fact that the insulating core panels will burn.
Yes.
So this is a photo that shows insulating core panels burning. Yes?
That is what she says.
It's not necessarily a photo that shows vertical fire spread, because we can't see which way the fire is going in a still image.
I follow.
Yeah? That might seem a bit pedantic, but I do think it's an important point. So I could assert that the insulating core panels have been ignited by falling burning debris rather than an upward fire spread mechanism. And on the basis of this image, I don't think you'd be able to say that I'm wrong.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. It does.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
It makes sense to me.
I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm
No,
just saying that I think it's difficult to assert that. I mean, we could discuss in detail my fire spread mechanisms. I suspect that we will.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you say that on the basis of this photograph, you couldn't confirm to a degree of confidence that the insulating core panels were a route of vertical fire spread.
That's correct. The insulating core panels burn, or the core material, the XPS inside, is a combustible material, and it will burn under some conditions. How it is that any one of those particular insulating core panels that appears to be burning in this image came to be burning, I think is almost a different question.
Now, I'm going to ask you, please, next to go to table 13 of your report, at page 175. Now, you've got a table at the top of that page, 13, approximate upward vertical fire spread rates in the Grenfell Tower fire as a function of building level. And I think we can see, is this right, that in general the rate of spread gets faster as the flame front gets further up the building?
Yes, that's true.
And you can see that. It only takes 80 seconds to go from level 10 to 13, but it takes only 15 seconds to go from 19 to 23.
That's correct.
It's travelling at a rate of 0.17 metres a second.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
Now, you I think say, and this is paragraph 847, just under that, you do say, that this is similar to vertical flame spread up a solid fuel surface. It's the last sentence of that paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, on a solid fuel surface, you would expect an exponential increase in the rate of spread based on the available research. Yes.
Right. Now, when you say a solid fuel surface, could you just explain what you mean by that?
So the scientific literature on vertical fire spread, dating back many decades, people have been running experiments on vertically oriented fuels so that we can try to understand the physics of the upward concurrent fire spread mechanism. Obviously, if you want to understand something that is actually quite complex in terms of the physics, even for a vertically oriented fuel that is totally homogeneous, is a single material, doesn't melt, doesn't drip, doesn't flow, doesn't warp, it's a very well-behaved material. Even studying upward concurrent fire spread on that very simple case is extremely complicated. In order to reproduce the physics. And I was at a conference 2 weeks ago where the keynote lecture was by a chap who is still trying to do this for the very simple case. And then you bring a second surface in, you have a cavity, and he just sort of put his hands in the air and said, forget it. Right. The models that we have, even the most advanced models, can't do this at this stage. So it's important to recognize the complexity of the science that we're dealing with here. But the theory of that, the experiments for that case of the really quite well-behaved fuel, show that as the fire spreads up, you will get, so the fire spreads up, but of course the bit that started burning is still burning, so your fire is getting effectively bigger and bigger as the fire spreads. At some stage you'll run out of fuel where it started, and then you've got like a moving band of fire, potentially, right? But as the fire is growing, and the heat release rate as a consequence is growing, as the amount of burning surface is growing, there's a snowballing effect. The more heat you have, the more preheating of the material above you get. The more preheating you get, the faster the fire will travel vertically upwards, and you get this exponential increase in fire spread rate. Now, obviously, at Grenfell Tower, we don't have a well-behaved fuel in the manner that I just described. We have a fuel that has aluminium facing on it in places. We have multiple fuels interacting with each other. We have an external surface. We have a cavity. We have burning, dripping, melting, falling. We have deformations. We have window openings. We have all sorts of complexities that we would have to account for if we wanted to model this in any meaningful way. But nonetheless, what we have is a vertical surface with distributed fuel on it, and we observe a similar outcome, which is a growing fire vertically, which causes this exponential increase in the rate of fire spread. So it's just to say that that exponential increase in fire spread is not unexpected. It is supported by the physics that we understand in general terms.
Now, I think you agree, is this right, with Professor Torero, that the flame spread that was observed at Grenfell Tower was not as rapid as that which was observed at the address in Dubai?
The progression of the upward spreading fire was significantly faster at the address fire, yes.
And that was also, wasn't it, a cladding fire involving polyethylene-filled ACM?
I mean, based only on media reports, yes.
Based on it, yes. Now, are you able to identify any reasons why the vertical flame spread at Grenfell was slower than that observed at, for example, the Dubai Tower, the address?
No. I mean, I could postulate some things, but they would be speculative. The one thing that one does observe at the address fire that one doesn't observe at Grenfell is that at the address fire, based on media reports, I think started at the 20th floor of a building that is much, much taller than Grenfell Tower, it needs to be pointed out.
Yes.
On a sort of a terrace, and then started to spread vertically. So in the case of that fire, and there was no external firefighting on the terrace early on, so in the case of that fire, all of the melting, dripping, burning polyethylene that fell onto the terrace and generated a large pool fire at the base of the vertically spreading fire, which keeps the heat release rate at the base of the fire strong and indeed grows,
right,
which then feeds the vertically spreading fire, which would be one explanation for an increased rate of fire spread in that scenario. Now at Grenfell Tower, you don't have a pool fire burning at the base of the building because you've got Murphy and Cornelius as evidenced in some of the videos. And whenever they have burning debris on the ground beneath flat 16, you actually will see them take their hose and direct it at the burning debris. They put it out and then they keep spraying the building. So the formation of a pool fire is prevented at Grenfell Tower. That's one possible explanation of a number that we could come up with. But again, the combination of materials, I don't know what backing insulation was used within the cavity at the address. Maybe, PIR, of all the backing cavity insulations we might choose, PIR is one of the least combustible of those materials that we might choose. It could have had XPS insulation. It could have had styrofoam or something. Yeah.
Now, moving ahead, you say in your report, and this is page 169, I don't think there's a need to go to it, that you say the flames reached the roof level at 1:27:58 or thereabouts.
Thereabouts, yeah.
And we can see from a picture or diagram at page 170. But perhaps we ought to look at that. This is figure 99. It's a photograph captured at 1:27:42 that the Crown was involved in the fire by this time. Is this about the earliest moment when the Crown was involved, or was it involved
there or thereabouts?
There or thereabouts.
I mean, I would say give or take 2-3 minutes.
Looking at this image, is there anything you can take from it which tells us anything about the mechanism for fire spread at the top of the building?
Not as yet, I would say. I mean, I think we do see it later in some of the videos and some of the photos, but this, on the basis of this photo, no.
Right. Now, you've got, I think, 5 hypotheses of vertical fire spread, which you cover under section 6.1.6 of your report at page 177 and following. And you conclude at paragraph 859, if I can just ask you to look at that page 178. You just highlight that, please, Paul. You say that of all of the available evidence presented thus far in section 6 of this report strongly supports hypothesis C1. I consider the presence of PE-filled ACM rain screen cladding cassettes to be, by a considerable margin, the most important factor contributing to upward vertical fire spread and indeed to external fire spread generally during the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yeah,
now, we'll look at some of this in a bit more detail, but Dr. Lane's opinion is that the columns on the building were the principal route for vertical flame spread. Do you agree with her?
Yeah, yes, I do.
Are you able to explain the mechanism by which flames were drawn into and up the columns?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a combination of mechanisms. I wouldn't say it's necessarily one distinct mechanism. I think they're a combination of factors, the respective contributions of which are difficult to quantify. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've taken a very mechanistic and systematic approach to dealing with this issue via a number of specific hypotheses which look individually at the various factors that we know can influence vertical fire spread.
Now, we know that siderise open-state intumescent cavity barriers were installed in the cladding system. Have you considered whether a different type of cavity barrier might have made a difference to vertical fire spread, whether through the columns or the spandrels?
In the manner that the cavity barriers were, assuming that the same installation was used, i.e. that the cavity barriers are broken at cladding rails, etc., etc.?
Yes, for example.
I wouldn't expect, no, I wouldn't think there would be any significant difference necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I've got an eye on the clock, which I personally should have had earlier. It's 3:20. This might be an appropriate time for a short
If it suits
break.
you, I think it would be a good time.
It does. I'm going to look at hypothesis C2 after the break.
Yeah. Right, well, Professor, we're going to have a short break now. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when you're out of the room, and we'll come back at 3:30.
Okay.
Right? Thank you very much. Good, 3:30, please. Okay. I think he's on his way, Mr. Millett. I'm sorry about the delay. Technical
No
glitch,
problem.
I believe. But anyway, ready to go on now?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Professor, I'm sorry about that. Can I, before I get back to hypothesis C2, just ask you a question about the application of water to the cladding? Was this cladding, I say cladding, the rain screen, hydrophobic in the sense that it repels water as a matter of course?
I mean, that's the purpose of it, so yes,
Yes.
one would hope.
Yes.
Yes.
Therefore, would it matter whether or not a covering jet was applied from above or below?
The reason I made a distinction between above and below is because of the nature of the openings in the rain screen cladding. So, I mean, I could demonstrate with a figure if that's a useful thing
Always
to do very
useful.
quickly. So if we look at, find it now. Ah, perfect. So, I mean, if we look at figure 19,
And that's page 46 of your report.
page 46, yes. Just as an example, that's showing the joint between column cassettes. And the point I was trying to make is if you're rain and you're coming down like this, the reason this joint is configured in this way is to prevent the rain from getting inside the cladding, to
Yeah.
let air get in to ventilate it. But if you're from down here and you're spraying up, one imagines that you could somehow get some water in
Right.
behind the cladding. That was the reason for that distinction.
Okay. But in general, the fact is that since the very large majority of this fascia is rain repellent or water repellent,
It's going to repel water, yes.
the actions of the fire brigade in external firefighting are, is this right, likely to have little effect?
If the cladding system is still intact,
Yeah.
and that it doesn't have holes having opened up in it, then yes, I would agree with that.
This may be a completely wild idea, no doubt you'll tell me if it is, but if you could get above the fire and put water down the cavity, would that be likely to do any good?
I wouldn't want to hazard a guess at that one. One imagines it couldn't make matters worse, but I wouldn't want to say the extent to which it would make matters better.
Fair enough, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. Now, turning to hypothesis C, can I take you back, please, to the foot of page 178 and the top of page 179 of your report, where you set out hypothesis C. And we could see at the top of page 179 what you say there. You say the presence of combustible PIR thermal insulation within the external cladding system significantly contributed to the rate and or extent of upward vertical fire spread observed at Grenfell Tower. Can you explain the mechanism by which it contributed?
Right, well, it's important to say firstly that that is the hypothesis that I'm testing rather than a statement, if you see what I mean.
It is.
I then come later to a conclusion on that statement later in that section.
You do?
On
and
page 180. But to
do.
answer your, I just think it's important to note that those are stated as hypotheses rather than facts or conclusions, if you see what I mean.
You're right, and I've jumped a stage, but perhaps in my eagerness to move on. But
The sort of the physical mechanisms, if you like, by which the primary physical mechanisms by which I would think the PIR could contribute to, we're in C, upward vertical fire spread, would be both PIR is a combustible material, so when exposed to a heat flux that is sufficient to reach the pyrolysis temperature, it will pyrolyze, it will release combustible pyrolysis products. Those combustible pyrolysis products could contribute to an increase in the local heat release rate of a fire. Yeah? So the extent to which that pyrolysis will occur and contribute is unquantified at this stage, but that's one potential mechanism. They could exacerbate heat release rate and thus accelerate upward vertical fire spread.
Absolutely. And
The other mechanism is that these materials are very low thermal inertia materials, which essentially means that the surface temperature of the PIR will rise very quickly when exposed to an external heat flux. And that hot PIR surface will radiate heat back at the ACM panels and effectively will insulate the cladding compartment or inside the cladding, and that could cause well, it prevents loss of heat from the system, thus potentially accelerating the upward flame spread, as compared with a backing insulation that is less thermally efficient,
Yes.
or i.e. has a higher thermal inertia. But again, the degree to which that potential assistance to upward vertical fire spread can be quantified at this stage is not good. Yeah, we don't know yet.
Yes. Now, on the basis of the mechanics of potential contribution, which you've referred to, would the insulation, the PIR, have contributed to the initial heating of the aluminium panels, and particularly the PE within it?
I mean, anything that keeps heat in the system, as a low thermal inertia material would, will contribute to a higher rate of temperature increase of anything else in the system. Yes.
So would it follow from that that if there were no such insulation or no such combustible insulation, the vertical spread of the fire would have been slower in its initial stages?
It's a slightly hypothetical question, but if the cavity were not insulated in any way, it would lose heat more rapidly, and therefore, yes, I will go along with that statement. Yes.
Or if it were insulated by something that was wholly non-combustible, if there is such a thing?
Well, it's important not to mix ideas here. So the combustibility is related to the additional heat release resulting from pyrolysis
Yes.
and production of combustible pyrolysis products. The low thermal inertia is about heat loss to the system. So the one situation is about heat production, and the other situation is about reducing heat loss. And they're independent, potentially independent mechanisms. So it's important that we consider them differently. So we could imagine if the backing insulation has a higher thermal inertia, is less thermally efficient as an insulator, that yes, there would be additional heat losses to that system, and the vertical progression of the fire would be slowed. My personal view is that in the context of the presence of the polyethylene, that would be hugely overshadowed by the fact that you have polyethylene in the system, which is freely burning.
Right.
So again, and as Professor Torero said a number of times yesterday, this is a hugely complex issue, and quantifying the relative contributions at this stage is very, very difficult. And we hope to do a lot of work at Phase 2 to try to quantify these things.
Yes,
but at this stage, I couldn't say.
Yes, I see. And just to be clear about that, is it possible, in theory at least, and for Phase 2 in your work, to quantify the difference between the rate of vertical fire spread with the insulation not burning, not paralysing, as opposed to the rate of vertical fire spread with the insulation paralysing?
Yeah, I mean, we already have work underway at the University of Edinburgh to try to look at the respective influences of these two issues, contributing pyrolysis products, how that affects vertical fire spread, compared with low thermal inertia and insulating the system,
yes,
and how that affects vertical fire spread. Although I should say, for cavity cladding systems that from a research perspective are far simpler than what we find on Grenfell Tower.
Right.
Yeah.
That leads in, I think, to a related issue. That paragraphs 877 and 2879, so 877, 878 and 879 on page 180, you refer to a large-scale test carried out by DCLG, as it then was, in the weeks following the Grenfell Tower fire. And you say these demonstrated that the use of PIR insulation within the rain screen cavity did not obviously exacerbate escalation of vertical fire spread, and you explain why. And then you say at 879, it should be noted that the PIR used in these tests was, as far as I've understood from the available reports, protected from direct flame impingement by foil facings or foil tape, i.e. the joints and cut edges were not exposed within the cavity in these tests, as appears to have been the case at Grenfell Tower. Now, just expanding on that, first of all, what, in your opinion, was the utility of the CLG or DCLG tests in determining whether the PIR, as installed at Grenfell Tower, contributed to the rate and extent of vertical fire spread, given the lack of foil facings we've seen on the edges at Grenfell?
What is the utility of the DCLG post-Grenfell tests, specifically with respect to the Grenfell Tower
Yes.
fire? Simply illustrative. in that what those tests show is that if you have an ACM PE rain screen, that the test, regardless of the backing insulation, escalates vertical fire spread very, very quickly. And that is really the only reason I've presented that information in this report.
Right.
Other than that, I would think they don't have much utility.
Are you able to tell whether it makes a difference that the assembly used in that test did not have cut edges of PIR?
I couldn't say one way or another.
Okay. Do you know whether in those tests the department used a riveted ACL panel rather than a cassette panel?
I believe that those were riveted.
Would that make a difference?
There is some information, and again, I'm not dealing with compliance in my phase 1 work, but there is some information I believe that we've received to the inquiry which indicates that a riveted system, as regards product classifications under standard testing, I think specifically through the test that we call the single burning item test, that the riveted system performs marginally better than the cassette system. The reason for that, I would presume, is because a riveted system, it's riveted through both faces of the aluminium and they're held more tightly in place and it prevents them from opening up. But I've not tested that theory.
Okay, moving to a slightly different issue. In terms of the state of the building after the fire, when you did your surveys, did you see areas of where the ACM panelling remained intact, even though there was extensive charring of the insulation behind it?
No. It's possible. I didn't see it.
Right, you didn't see it. Did you see any areas on level 3 where there was widespread charring to a depth, and where the damage to the PE was highly localized and more severe on the inner face than the outer face?
The damage to the
panel, the
to the
ACM
PIR
paneling was more severe on the inner face.
I've not observed that. No.
Right. Did you see any evidence low down on the corner columns where soot deposits at the joint in the panels might suggest that the fire was burning internally rather than within the paneling?
I didn't see that. Low down at the column tips, there's typically quite a bit of evidence of melted, dripped polyethylene, which is solidified in that location. But I didn't see any soot, or at least I didn't notice it.
Right. Your next hypothesis is hypothesis C3 at page 180. I'll take this quickly. This is continuous vertical channels and extensive internal cavities. And your conclusion is at 888, I think, which is that you say, this is page 181, at the time of writing, I'm not aware of any definitive evidence that continuous vertical channels and extensive cavities, which have been shown to exist within the refurbishment external cladding system of Grenfell Tower, played a role in promoting or accelerating upward vertical fire spread. Now, just taking that a little bit slowly, first of all, when you say definitive, what do you mean?
I guess I couldn't say for certain that it plays a role that would significantly accelerate the vertical fire spread.
Right. Are you able to say within a range of probabilities whether the continuous vertical cavities and channels on the columns played some role in the fire spread vertically?
Yeah, yes, I think it's likely.
Likely.
I think it's likely that they did. Yes, and I think I do come to that at the end of that section 896, I believe. Yes. I think I say on a balance of probabilities, given the available video evidence and oral testimony, along with the known importance of vertical channels, I consider it likely that these features contributed, although I can't quantify it at this stage.
Yeah. So you're not able to say how likely?
I think it's very likely that they contributed to some extent. I think it's almost certain that they contributed to some extent.
Right.
Whether that's 1% worse or 50% worse, I wouldn't be able to say at this stage.
No, I see. Okay. So the difficulty you have is not the likelihood of the contribution; it's the extent of it.
It's the significance of that contribution to the outcome.
Quantitatively.
Yes. Quantitatively. Yes.
Hypothesis C4, which is prevailing wind, you can reject, and you have. Hypothesis C5, which is your last one on vertical fire spread, relates to the specific overall geometry of the building, and you cover that at paragraphs 903 and following on page 182, and you explain what the geometry is. And you say at paragraph 911 on page 183, in the pre-penultimate line, it's not possible to definitively to determine, well, I'm not sure I've picked up the complete conclusion, that perhaps it's 912. You say on the basis of the available evidence it's not possible to accept or reject hypothesis C5. However, in my opinion, it's plausible to suggest that the presence of the protruding column wing wall at 135 degrees could have played an as yet unquantified role in promoting rapid upward vertical fire spread. Additional work would be required at phase 2 to confirm and quantify this. Now, to what level of confidence are you able to say that the presence of the protruding column wing wall did play a role?
Well, so the physics at play here is two effects. One effect is that having the fire confined within a corner, even if it's not a right-angle corner, it does two things. It changes the way that fresh air is entrained into the fire, which it means essentially you're going to get less air entrained into the fire at its base because there's restricted access to the fire because of its confinement. That has an effect of elongating the flame as the flame searches for more air in order to continue burning. So you have flame elongation in a confined area, which would exacerbate upward vertical fire spread in the same way as confining a fire within a cavity causes flame extension. And the other effect, of course, is that if you have a flat wall, then the wall looks out and sees the cold world. If you have walls at some angle to each other, then part of what the one wall sees is the other wall, which is hot. And you get a re-radiation effect, which causes the temperatures to increase locally, which again will exacerbate vertical fire spread. So I think I think plausible is perhaps not as strong as I ought to have used. I think it's very likely that there will be some effect, but again, quantifying it is the challenge. And I'm not aware of any work in the technical literature that looks at wing walls at angles other than 90 degrees. So the extent to which that is important, I couldn't say at this stage.
At this stage, but can further work be done at phase 2?
Further work could definitely be done. I have a project planned. Yes.
Right. Okay. Just picking up a couple of points of detail. Paragraph 906 within that hypothesis, you refer to column lines offering continuous and unbroken vertical lines of combustion rain screen cladding along with combustible PIR insulation, i.e. vertical lines of available fuel unbroken by windows. And you then say this created a continuous and uninterrupted vertical fuel bed to support upward vertical fire spread and will have influenced, i.e. increased the propensity for upward vertical fire spread. You, and I think, refer at you referred at footnote 56 to section 4.9.1. But can I take you to page 32 of your report, which I don't think is something we've looked at today. It's figure 8. It's within section 3.1 of your report, Professor, and it's a drawing, effectively, from Celotex. Can you identify where the continuous vertical lines of combustible cladding and PIR insulation are by reference to that drawing?
Noting my previously stated color blindness, I think they're pink sections, left and right hand sides. If they were to continue vertically up and down outside that image,
right,
those would be the continuous bands that I'm referring to.
Okay. Now, keeping a finger in that, and perhaps I'll just do this by telling you. At 907 on page 183, you refer to spandrel lines offering continuous and unbroken horizontal lines of combustible rain screen cladding, along with combustible PIR insulation within the rain screen cavity, i.e. horizontal lines unbroken around the full perimeter of the building at all levels from level 3 and above. And you say that created an uninterrupted horizontal supply of fuel capable of supporting horizontal fire spread by a number of different routes and mechanisms. A number of routes and mechanisms. Again, coming back to figure 8 on page 32, can you identify those very briefly for us?
But those are the blue sections.
The blue sections.
Yeah.
Now,
And to be fair, they're continuous and uninterrupted only because the columns also provide a means for them to pass by the column, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Now finally on upward fire spread, Dr. Lane says, and we don't need to go to this unless you want to, and it's her report at paragraph 10.4.20 at page 28. She says that the cladding rails for spandrel panels provided a route for vertical fire spread because they essentially bypass the cavity barriers. Do you agree with her?
I do.
Right. I can now turn to downward fire spread, and you cover that at section 6.2 of your report, starting on page 184. And is it right, Professor, that downward spread, in your opinion, is caused by two things? One, the melting and running downwards of the polyethylene, and second, the opposed flow flame spread?
Yes, with the first of those being the dominant one.
Right, the melting and running downwards of PE.
Correct.
Now, you've defined, I think, opposed flow flame spread in your report on page 184 in footnote 58. And I take it that is the definition that you're using. What role, in general terms, did opposed flow flame spread play in the downward spread of fire, in contradistinction to melting and dripping?
At Grenfell Tower.
At Grenfell Tower.
I think likely to be a very small and potentially insignificant role.
Right. Now, your view, I think, is that you can see downward fire spread earliest along column lines. Is that right? And that's para 926 at page 189. Can I just take you through a number of figures from that part of the report, starting at page 190, if we can just jump ahead to that, and start with figure 110, and I'm going to run through from that to figure 114 over 3 pages. If you go through, starting with 110, you say there, it's an extract from a video captured at approximately 250, and it appears to show dripping material and downward fire spread at the corner of column A5 and the north face. So that's essentially the northeast corner, is it? Mm-hmm. Yes. You identify dripping burning material there, just hanging down on the right-hand side from the main.
Sorry, that's the northwest corner.
Northwest corner. It's the northwest corner, is it? Yes. Okay. Then you've got, is it the same corner where you've, in the next photograph, downward fire spread? Is one a continuation of the other?
Yes, and in fact, in one of my videos, it'll be either the north face video or the west face video. There is video footage of this, which is far more instructive, to be honest,
yes.
than the images. But the images tell the story, if you like. And yes, the two things I would highlight there is that along the right-hand side of that corner column, you see clear downward fire spread. If it was a video, you'd see progression of that fire front down the column. And you also see the lines of light that are on the column. There's sort of one line and then a secondary line slightly further below at story heights. And those are the horizontal breaks in the cassettes along the column. And I believe that what we're seeing there is pooling of burning polyethylene on that little shelf that I showed previously in my diagram.
Yes.
As the polyethylene drips down inside the columns.
So just on this picture, if you could point that out, you may have to get up. I'm sorry to make you do that.
No
just
problem.
pick that up.
Yeah, sort of here.
Yes.
And here.
Yes.
And you see it actually on every column on the building where we have video evidence. You see this occurring. You see these lines light up ahead of the obvious external fire spread, and so you have this progression of the dripping polyethylene down. And it pools locally on horizontal surfaces within the building. That could be these sort of little shelves that you get at the junctions. It could actually be on top of cavity barriers within the system, which essentially provide shelves inside the cladding system. And I believe that's one of the key mechanisms of downward fire spread. And then you have a locally burning pool fire of polyethylene, which can heat the material here in these cladding cassettes, melt them, and then a progression further of the polyethylene down the building. Right.
Just before we leave that picture, you can see some way below where the downward fire spread arrow is pointing, there's another bright pinpoint of light. Do you see?
Just here.
There, yes. What is that?
It might be just falling debris.
Right.
It's hard to say from a still. We could look at the video. I suppose. But
Moving on then to the next figures, 112 and 113 on page 191. Again, you could see dripping burning material in both of those pictures, falling and landing on window details. That's what you say in relation to figure 113. Again, can you point anything specific out from there about how it is that that burning, dripping material is actually spreading fire?
yeah, I mean, this is actually, I think, a very important point. We see this inclined front of the flame here. It's also, I mean, it's also interesting to point out that after that very bright line passes, we see much less flaming. We have compartment fires burning within these fires now, but we see dark patches on the cladding, which does go to this question of the extent to which the backing insulation is still contributing once the polyethylene has burned out of the rain screen cladding, and indicates that not so much would be the answer to that question. Yeah. But nonetheless, you see we have this diagonal line here. The bits that we've circled here, again, if this was in a video, what you would see is material falling down, landing on either the window sills or in cases where the cassettes have disappeared on top of cavity barriers and forming these localized pool fires, which then cause generation of energy up and further fuel this diagonal line. Yes. But the key thing I wanted to mention was, if we imagine that this diagonal line sort of stays a diagonal line, which is what we do observe when we watch the progression of these flame fronts or fire fronts across the face of the building, if it starts here at the top corner, which is where it does start based on the images we looked at a minute ago, we could imagine that diagonal line just moving down like this. And the consequence of that would be an apparent lateral. Yes. Because it's a diagonal line just moving down, right? We could also imagine that that line goes like this, and it would look just the same. So the question is, how much of the lateral fire spread is that, which is opposed flow along the spandrel panel? How much of the lateral fire spread is that, which is dripping, burning polyethylene? Now, clearly it's some combination of those two. My view is it's predominantly this. Right. The dripping and melting.
Now, what enables you from this or the other photographs we've been looking at to form that view?
It's a combination of the fact that opposed flow fire spread on the spandrel panels would be quite a difficult thing to have happen, because these are aluminium coated polyethylene rain screen panels, so they tend not to spread fire laterally unless there's some other factor at play. Opposed flow fire spread in a lateral sense relies on there being fuel ahead of the flame front, and it relies on there being energy getting to the fuel ahead of the flame front. If you have a burning ACM PE cord rain screen panel, there's two questions you have to ask. The first question is, where does the energy go? The energy goes mostly up. And the second question you have to ask is, where does the fuel go? And the fuel goes mostly down. Granted, some of the energy goes with it because it's burning. So if your energy goes mostly up and your fuel goes mostly down, you're not left with much to cause lateral.
Right.
Right? That, combined with the fact that when we observe the video, in particular the thermal imaging video from the helicopters, the MPAS videos that were taken on the night, when they switch to a thermal imaging filter in those videos, hopefully we'll have a chance to see some of it, it is really striking the amount of hot burning debris that is falling down this building, which is not visually obvious when you look at an optical view. When you look at thermal imaging, it's like a waterfall of molten burning material falling off the side of this building, contributing to heating of the cladding below the flame front. So on those two bases, I think it's far more likely that the lateral is this diagonal line moving down rather than sideways.
Now, you have set out a number of hypotheses for downward fire spread, downward vertical fire spread, starting on page 197, and you've got essentially three hypotheses, D1, D2, and D3. Starting with D1, if I can, at the foot of page 197, that is, or the top of page 198, that the downward vertical fire spread observed at Grenfell Tower was primarily due to the presence of aluminium composite ACM rain screen cassettes with polyethylene PE filler. And your conclusion about that is to be found in the paragraph immediately below at 948, where you say that it's considered to be the dominant and decisive factor contributing to downward vertical fire spread. That's clear enough. Can I just ask you whether you formed a view about whether the alu glazed panels contained in the infill panels and the panels supporting the vent extract fans contributed as a source of melting and dripping material, contributing in turn to downward fire spread?
I think it's possible, but I think that the potential is in comparative terms, quite small.
Right.
I would base that opinion on two key arguments. The first would be that, as I've already discussed, when XPS is exposed to a heat source, it tends to shrink away from the flame and then burn in situ. It is capable of forming a pool fire under the right conditions, but in small quantities, heated quite severely, I would expect it not to necessarily do that. And indeed, the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation that we have from the LFB about the Shepherd's Court or Shepherd's Bush fire, that shows some experiments that were done by Bureau Veritas in the wake of that fire to look at panels that have the same, at least it appears to be the same, it's a blue XPS insulation. And in that case, they actually do set alight some panels and they don't see pooling, but they do see shrinking away from the flame. So for that reason, I would say probably not that substantial an effect. The secondary reason is that the XPS is 25 millimeters thick, but it has a density that's almost an order of magnitude less than the PE, and it's only present, as Dr. Lane has said, over 13% of the exterior of the building, as opposed to something more like 70% for the ACM panels. So the mass of material is a fraction of the mass of PE present. Its heat of combustion is less by about 10% than PE. So we have less of it. It has less heat of combustion, and it tends not to form pool fires when not in large quantities. So for that basis, I would say, I mean, clearly it's going to contribute, but I think it's probably small or negligible.
Mm-hmm. Now, turning to your hypothesis D2, that's on page 199 at paragraphs 952 and following, you say there, and I summarise, that the exposed edges of the PIR insulation may have contributed indirectly to downward fire spread, but you say there's no, quotes, compelling evidence, unquotes, that it played a role, and that's paragraph 957.
Yeah.
If we just have that up on the screen, no compelling evidence. But I think you go on to say that it may have played a minor role by insulating or heating within the cavity, and we've covered that before. Is that the same mechanism?
It's the same idea,
that
yes.
we saw in relation to vertical?
It's keeping heat within the system,
right,
which has to do something, and that would just accelerate the downward. Yep.
Now, hypothesis D3 at the top of page 200 is the continuous vertical channels and extensive internal cavities contributing to downward fire spread. And you cover that at paragraphs 958 to 962 there on that page. Is your conclusion there that it's likely that downward fire spread would have been somewhat slower, as you say at 962, had these channels and extensive internal cavities not been present? That conclusion, is that confirmed by your visual evidence?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So I mean, there's extensive evidence at Grenfell Tower of solidified polyethylene in the locations of those cavities that has dripped down from above to the cooler parts of the building near the base. And you have large quantities of polyethylene in the base of the building in those locations, which is fairly compelling evidence.
Now I want to turn to horizontal spread and the crown, if I can. And I'm going to show you a little bit of video. Again, I should repeat the trigger warning. This is very much, this building, very much on fire, and a lot of people might find that distressing. There is also some audio that goes with it. Again, people might find that distressing, so that if they don't feel they're up to seeing it, then they should either leave this room or remove themselves from the live stream. Mm-hmm. Now I get to ask, 529, yeah. Right, this is video 4, Paul. I'm going to ask you to pause if there's anything you think we should be looking at. This is in the context of horizontal spread and particularly the crown contributing to fire spread. And we can start at 5 29 or 5:30. 5 minutes and 30 seconds. If we can start, Mr. Chairman, I think we should start now.
Yes,
Can.
you're right.
You can stop it there, Paul. So yeah, this is just a video showing that still that we looked at a few minutes ago,
yes.
Where you can clearly see the material, the burning material, dropping down the right-hand side of that corner column. This being the northwest corner. You can see the formation of these bands of light at the junctions between the columns, and hopefully this is one part of the video where we actually observe that progression. But I couldn't say if it is for sure. Right. Go ahead. Yeah. So this
is the impasse. This is some impasse.
Yes. Thank you for the preemptive stop, Paul. So yeah, this is some of the impasse image where it appears they're using some kind of thermal filter or thermal imaging filter here, night vision, and it's just instructive, I think, to look as this video progresses. Obviously, the regions that are burning appear to have saturated the filter because they're so hot, but you can see the amount of hot debris that's falling from the tower, which really, I think, supports this idea of the downward mechanism.
Right. Do you want him to continue?
Yes. I mean, I guess the other comment I would make here is it's not so clear here, but you can see that the furthest extent of progression of this fire is along the crown on the west face. So the furthest horizontal progression as we move around the building as the fire progresses, in all 5 of the videos that I've produced, demonstrates that the fire progression around the building, both clockwise and anti-clockwise, if you're looking from above, is at the crown. Yeah. And that the rate of that spread is actually reasonably consistent throughout the duration of the fire. So it's almost like a linear fuse moving around the top of the building.
Should we continue and see if we can see more?
Thank you very much. Can anyone tell me if it's all under control at Clarendon Walk? Any other?
GT, I think it's Clarendon Walk. There is no Clarendon Walk, I don't think.
Don't need that one at all. Can we then go to 707? Let's move on to the next sequence. Sequence 4. And just tell us if there's anything you want to point out.
Anytime here. So yes. Yeah, here you get a nice close-up view at the level of the crown. It's hard to see, but you see these sort of vertical lines. These are the vertical elements of the crown. You can see that the crown itself is burning, and beneath the crown you have what appears to be, to my eye, a pool of polyethylene which is melting on the coping element that sits directly beneath the crown.
Is that the leading edge of the flame front on that face at that point?
It is at that point in time, yeah.
Should we continue to see how that progresses a little bit?
Stated or received?
GT from 412 BS.
All units wait, all units wait.
MP from Bravo Sierra 1. You have uniform 531 heading across to help 621. 621, hold your ground.
Bravo Sierra 1, you are clear and readable, won't be there.
Thank you. 621, let us know when help is there.
Yeah, there's starting to get antisocial behaviour and there's a lot of potential, so I'm by myself at the moment, sir.
I think we've probably come to the end of what may be useful for you to comment on, but if there's anything else in these sequences that you think assists illustrating horizontal spread, particularly at the crown.
No, I mean, I think what I commented on previously says it all. The hypothesized mechanism at the crown is probably worth restating, that those crown elements burn and spread fire preferentially.
Yes.
And create what is essentially a fuse around the top of the building. The mechanism is they burn, they drip polyethylene onto the coping directly below them. Formation of a localized pool fire, which progresses laterally, ignites the next crown elements, and it progresses around the building.
Yep. Thank you. Now, the other thing to pick up here is that you say in your report at page 238, moving ahead significantly in it, to the to the beginning of horizontal fire spread hypotheses, and you have a number of hypotheses under E. At paragraph 114, you say it's worth noting that under normal conditions, upward spreading fires and fire plumes tend to spread outward as they travel upward. That's because the heat and smoke which travel upward from a fire form an inverted cone that widens as it rises due to the entrainment of fresh air into the fire plume. And so that results in a characteristic V pattern. Is the spread at the crown simply an example of that V pattern, or is it different?
No, I mean, I believe that what is driving the spread at the crown is the lateral progression of the pool fire beneath it.
Right.
Yes.
And not the inverted cone effect from vertical spread.
No. If that were the case, then I would have expected the way we observe fire to progress around the building to be different than it is. I would have expected the vertical fire spread up the east face to be more of a cone in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, turning to your hypotheses, I think I can take these quite quickly. E1, para 1115, page 238. Is it right that your hypotheses are not as well developed in relation to horizontal fire spread as they are in relation to vertical and downward, upward and downward spread?
The hypotheses are not as well developed. I mean, I think we have more of them because there were more things we wanted to just make sure.
Yeah.
Or rather, I was many ideas were popping in as to what could be causing this lateral. I mean, it's worth noting that I think, as Professor Torero said yesterday, the Grenfell Tower fire is quite unusual in the context of lateral or horizontal fire spread, in that when we've seen other fires in buildings that have similar rain screen materials, we tend not to see the entire building engulfed. So the question is, why has that happened at Grenfell Tower? The distinguishing feature appears to be the crown, but I wanted to make sure that I looked at every possible option. So that's why we have a large number. I'm not sure I would agree that they're less developed. I mean, I think that it's such an unusual mechanism that I'm proposing or hypothesizing, in that it's not something we see every day. Upward fire spread on combustible material is pretty straightforward. Downward fire spread by burning, dripping thermoplastics is pretty straightforward. This lateral mechanism is, if you like, a unique situation, which is a consequence of the architectural features of Grenfell Tower. So it's the fire spread mechanism for which I certainly want to do a lot more work at phase 2 to make sure that we interrogate that and test that hypothesis to show whether or not that is the dominant mechanism, as I believe it is.
Now, I think your initial assessment, at least at this stage, perhaps subject to further work, is that the dominant cause, it's your phrase, of horizontal spread was a combination of pooling of melting or melted and dripping polyethylene, and also the tendency of fire plumes to widen as they move upwards.
A combination of those two.
Are you able to give us any kind of quantification as to which is the dominant of those two?
Well, in the absence of the melting, dripping, and pooling, the upwards wouldn't matter. So, the upwards spreading is almost a consequence of the downward spreading.
Now, Dr. Lane says that the horizontal spread would also have occurred across the exposed edges of polyethylene on the spandrel panels. Do you agree with that?
Again, that would be an opposed flow fire spread mechanism on a fuel in a horizontal direction. As I discussed earlier,
yes.
The important question there is, where does the energy go, where does the fuel go? And on the basis of my answer, you've probably got a sense that I don't think that's a particularly important mechanism in this case.
Right. As to hypothesis E2, which is paragraph 1126 at page 239, I think your conclusion is that, in theory, PIR could contribute to the spread of flame, but you can't quantify the extent of that contribution. Is that a fair way of summarising your view of that hypothesis?
I think it's possible, but I've no evidence to suggest that it did.
Are you able to express any view now on the extent to which the presence of PIR contributed to the horizontal spread of fire?
Not in any quantified way, no.
Right. Dr. Lane's view is that, at least at an early stage, the presence of cut and exposed PIR edges in the cladding structure may have along the spandrel panels, may have supported horizontal flame spread. Can you agree with that, or can you not offer a view?
I think it's possible. The thing that's important to recognize about that is that in order for flame to spread in an opposed flow mode horizontally, even on a PIR Celotex specifically, that isn't protected with a foil facing, i.e. at a cut edge, you need a significant external heat flux that is sustained. And so in the absence of a significant external heat flux causing it to continue progressing, which means you kind of already need a fire there,
yes.
You're not going to see that. The lateral fire spread on PIR in the absence of an external heat flux will stop, generally. Right.
Okay. Hypothesis E3, page 240, para 1135. That hypothesis is that continuous vertical channels and extensive internal cavities present in the structure contributed to the rate of horizontal fire spread. Your opinion is that, I think this is 1135, that it was not likely.
I mean, not directly, although obviously indirectly as a consequence of having influenced both the vertical upward and downward.
Yeah. Is there any evidence that cavity barriers were at all effective in initially preventing horizontal fire spread
not
prior to the point at which the fire reached the crown?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And indeed, as I've mentioned, I think there is evidence that after the fire front had passed a particular level on a building, that whatever polyethylene was remaining tended to form pools and burn locally on top of the cavity barriers, potentially making matters a bit worse.
Yes, and we can see hypotheses E4 and E5. And your conclusions about that. E4 you reject, and E5 is about the architectural crown, and you've explained the role already that you play in relation, that you say it played in relation to that. There's also a hypothesis E6, which is the contribution made, if any, by the aluminium and XPS composite window infill panels. And I think your conclusion there is that they played a role, but you can't quantify it. I'm summarising, perhaps. Inaccurately, but is that a fair description of your view about that?
This is with reference to the infill panels?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, the infill panels, as we've discussed, they have fuel in them that is combustible and can burn. So in a fire that's progressing laterally, I would expect that fuel to become involved somehow and contribute. But yes, quantifying it, I couldn't do that at this stage.
Okay. Now, Dr. Lane says, and again for reference purposes, it's page 31 of part 10 of her report at paragraph 10.5.9, that this is her pathway C. She says these panels can connect to the other combustible materials at the head and the sill of the window, and therefore provided a route above and below for horizontal fire spread. In reaching your own conclusion on hypothesis E6, did you take that view into account?
Yes, but again, it seems to me that would require what is effectively, again, an opposed flow lateral fire spread mechanism. And for the same reasons that I think it's unlikely on the ACM panel, which is a combustible material with 2 aluminium skins, I think it's unlikely to occur on an infill panel.
And given the way that you already described XPS behaving which is in a different way, with a higher ignition point, I think, than polyethylene, would that also mean that you think it's unlikely that that would have been a route for horizontal fire spread?
I mean, I think to call it a route for horizontal fire spread is not something that I would confidently state. I think when the infill panels get hot, the foam inside them will potentially pyrolyze. That will release flammable pyrolysis products. Those products will burn if there's a fire around. What the consequences of that are for a lateral fire spread mechanism, I couldn't say. I would expect them to have some influence undoubtedly, but I wouldn't be able to quantify it, and I wouldn't suggest that it's a significant one.
Very, very good. Can I finally turn to the last topic, which is spread back into the building? Just one or two questions about that. You've covered that at part 7 of your report, at page 253 under section 7.3, possible routes of fire ingress. And you've identified from paragraphs 1167 to 1172 5 possible routes for ingress of smoke and fire back into the building. My question is, are these set out in any order of likelihood?
The 5 routes...
Yes, so it's page 253, 1168, open windows, 1169, extract fan units, 1170, pre-existing gaps.
No, they're not set. They're not set out in any order of likelihood, but throughout the following section, and in particular on the basis of evidence from the bereaved survivors and residents, the conclusion that I get to on this, incidentally, that evidence is very helpful in this regard, is that it would appear that the routes of ingress depend on the nature of the fire spread that is adjacent to the flat. So early on in vertical upward fire spread, where the fire is still quite small, then the ingress routes are related to the extract fan and the window construction. And we have comments in the witness statements to that effect, in particular associated with the extract fan and early failures of the extract fans. As the fire grows and becomes large, as Professor Torero said yesterday, glazing is actually not that resistant to high heat fluxes, and we have comments from certainly in the flat 6s as we move up the building as the fire is growing, people refer to their windows exploding inwards quite suddenly and with very little warning prior to failure of the extract fan. So the ingress routes depend on the mechanism of upward. As the fire is larger, the mechanism changes. And whilst I haven't looked at the witness statements as regards the ingress during downward or lateral fire spread yet, my expectation would be, again, as Professor Torero commented yesterday, that the construction around the window and the influence of the extract fans would be more important because the downward spread mechanism is locally a smaller fire with lower heat fluxes than the very large heat fluxes you get in the vertical upward spread with a big fire plume.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. And I think you summarised that effectively under section 7.5 as a section summary at paragraphs 1204 to the end of that section.
Yes.
Professor, you'll be glad to know that I've come to the end of my questions with 2 minutes to go before 4:30. I'm going to do what we customarily do, which is to ask the chairman to rise for a few minutes to see whether there are any questions that I have not asked this afternoon, which I should be asking. So if I can do that,
yes,
that'd be helpful.
Well, if you don't mind, we're going to keep you a little bit longer. We'll
no problem.
Have a 5-minute break to let council take stock.
Okay.
And then see if there are any more questions.
Sure.
All right. So we'd like to go with the usher now, and we'll keep this as short as we can.
Yes. Will we have an alarm?
Well, I'm going to say 5 minutes, Mr. Millett, or sooner if you can do it sooner. Thank you.
Soon. In Charter's option.
Professor. I think there'll be a few more questions, but before we continue, can I just remind everybody that there will be a routine fire alarm test at 4:45. The announcement will tell you not to take any action, and that's quite right. So just be aware that that's going to happen, but just ignore it. Yes, Mr. Willett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Professor, just one or two further questions. First, I want to ask you about the failure of the aluminium window frames. When you were doing your work leading to this report, did you consider whether there was any evidence which showed that aluminium frames had failed?
Not in the early stages of the fire, as would be relevant to the fire spread.
Right, let me show you something. Can I please ask the witness to have up MET 000-10867, which is the witness statement provided to the police by Daniel Brown, firefighter Brown. MET 000-10867. And I'd like you to be shown, please, page 10 of that. That's 000. MET 000. That's it. 10867. Page 10. There. Now, in the second from last paragraph, this is Daniel Brown's statement, and he was one of the first pairs, or he was in the first pair into flat 16. He says, I realised that where I'd seen the curtain of flame was in fact where the window had been. The window and frame were no longer there, and it had completely dropped out, leaving a hole in the wall. I carried on following the line on the ceiling to above the fridge, and then noticed in the corner of my eye an orange ember falling outside the window area. So I looked out the window to investigate what this was. Now, he gives evidence that the frame had dropped out. Does that tell you anything? Does that affect your view of the means of egress of this fire from flat 16?
I mean, I'm reasonably certain the frame hadn't dropped out.
He says it did.
I'm reasonably certain that it's still there after the fire. So we should have photos to confirm that.
Right. But
I'm reasonably certain that the aluminium window frames of flat 16 are still there. So the entire frame has not dropped out.
On the hypothesis, let's assume for the moment that the chairman were to find that it did, as a matter of fact. How would that affect your view, if at all?
How would it affect my view?
Of the means of fire egress from the compartment?
Does he say at what time this is?
Well, this would be after 1:20.
This would be after 1:20,
yes.
Then it wouldn't affect my view.
Right. Then it may not help that I ask this next question, but I'll ask it anyway. Now, you say in paragraph 386 that, and I won't take you back to it, that the windows used in Grenfell are constructed from an extruded aluminium profile with a polyamide thermal break built into the frames. Is that material something which melts at a much lower temperature than aluminium?
I haven't looked recently at the specific properties of polyamide, but it tends to be a polymer that has better than typical thermal performance. One of the reasons in fact, I believe their product sheet states that the reason they use polyamide is so that they can have a thermal break prior to coating them, which involves elevated temperature processing. So, but yeah, I think certainly that temperatures below the 600, 660 that we would expect for aluminium, yes.
Yeah. So if it has a polymer in it and it melts, do you consider that the window frame would fail at a temperature lower than the normal temperature for aluminium, which is 660 degrees centigrade also?
It depends what we mean by fail. So it depends what role the polyamide thermal break is playing from a mechanical perspective within the window frame. I wouldn't be familiar enough with the system at this stage to say if loss of that thermal break would cause a mechanical failure of the window frame. It's possible, but again, I'm speculating. It's certainly something that I'll look at on the basis of that question.
Yes. Can I please ask you to be shown the clip or your first clip, and go to 112? This is a question which I've been asked to ask you about jets. And the reason I've been asked to ask you this is that in your evidence in July, you said that there was evidence of water being applied by jet at 112. I just want to look at the video to see, just to be precise with you, exactly what you were, and maybe still are, talking about.
At 112?
At 112.
I think what I hope what I said is that there's evidence of water on the ground at 112.
Warning, trigger warning, usual trigger warning. Possibly seeing fire on the building, although this clip isn't supposed to. Can I just wait 10 seconds and then ask the question? Can we please be shown the clip at 112? Start at 112 and 0 seconds, please, Paul.
Yeah. It's over.
Did you see any evidence there of the application of water at 112?
No, I mean, I think what you're referring to is there does appear to be water on the ground below flat 16 at 112.
Yes.
There's two, in my mind, this is something that I've considered at some length in looking at the issues we discussed previously with respect to the potential jet at 111. One explanation is that it's my understanding that when a hose is charged, it's not uncommon for a firefighter to just give it a quick spray to test that everything is fine as it should be before they start their deployment. So it could be that that is the reason for their water being on the ground at that time. The other possibility is that there is, I believe, evidence of burning debris on the ground prior to 112. And it's conceivable that the firefighters who were on site there decided to put that burning debris out, as we no longer see it burning here at 112, and that is the reason for the water on the ground at 112. So yes, I've considered it at some length, and those are the two explanations I can come up with.
Professor, thank you very much. Those are the extra questions I had for you. It remains for me to say thank you very much to you for coming along today to assist us with our investigations and give your evidence. We're extremely grateful. Thank you.
No problem.
I'd add my thanks to those of Mr. Millett. We're really grateful to you for putting your expertise at our disposal. You've produced some very substantial reports, and you've explained them all very fully, and I, for one, have found it very interesting and helpful. So,
thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, well, now you're free to go. The usher will look after you.
Mr. Chairman, just before 4:45, that is the business for the day.
Yes, thank you very much.
May I have your attention, please?
10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
The fire alarm system is about to be tested.